Hello everyone, Mike the Warrior here, and today we're doing 5 facts about Masquerade. When the evil Bakugan Naga stole the Silent Core, he caused a chain reaction, which resulted in an accident at Professor Michael's lab when his granddaughter Alice was with him. This resulted in Dr. Michael being corrupted and turning into the villain known as Hal G, while Alice turned into Masquerade. You could say Masquerade is the personification of all of the negative emotion inside of Alice, or maybe a more accurate way of putting it is he is the exact opposite, her negative. While Alice is kind and supportive, Masquerade is cold and manipulative, and he clearly takes joy in watching his enemies suffer, such as when he defeated Drago and sent him to the Doom Dimension while Dan begged him not to. Masquerade isn't only the first villain, he's also the first of many villains to start a trend that would be repeated till the end of the series. For example, he is the first masked rival of Dan Kuso, and then much later in New Vestroia, Spectra would pretty much be filling in that role after Masquerade's absence. And while we didn't have one in Gundalian Invaders, Mactanium Surge, the villain Primordius returned as Magmal. And in part 2 of Mactanium Surge, we had the masked villain Wise Man. Speaking of Wise Man, that leads us into our next trope. Because Masquerade was Alice the entire time, Alice viewed herself as a traitor to her friends. And while this isn't technically true, we did have a betrayal each season of Bakugan, with Alice, though quotations around that one. In New Vestroia, we had Mira who betrayed the Brawlers for her brother. In Gundalian Invaders, we had Ren betray the Brawlers, and Jake too, I guess. In Mactanium Surge Part 1, we had Solon who betrayed everyone for Magmal. And in Part 2, we actually had a fake out at the very end. All the signs pointed to Guds being Wise Man the entire time, but that wasn't actually the case. I always thought this was pretty interesting because it was almost like they were aware they were pretty much doing the same thing. Then they switched it up over. Masquerade was a force of nature, as he used the original rules to his advantage. For starters, Masquerade, along with everyone who was working for him, raised the stakes of each game they were in because they added the new Doom card. The Doom card was an extra ability card that wouldn't use up your 3 ability card slots, that you would activate as soon as the game started. Once the Doom card is played, if the owner of said card wins a round, they send the opponent's Bakugan to the Doom Dimension, where they're never allowed to come back. The other thing that made Masquerade a true threat is while most players usually only had one ace Bakugan up their sleeve, Masquerade technically had 3. The first one was Darkest Reaper. After the first battle with Masquerade, there were a couple of filler episodes where Dan fought a bunch of other characters who were using the Doom card. And during this little arc, Masquerade would lend any Darkest Battler his Reaper. It was a good way to try to raise the stakes. The problem is, Dan pretty much beat Reaper every single time. So, when Masquerade started to fight again, we've already seen Reaper lose so much, this guy isn't scary anymore. So, what did they do? Masquerade already had a replacement, Darkest Hydronoid, who fed off of the Bakugan that was sent to the Doom Dimension to make him stronger. And to show he was the new top dog, he actually kills Reaper and sends him to the Doom Dimension. In the Japanese version, we actually see him punch a hole through Reaper with his tail, but the dub censored this for obvious reasons. And his third Bakugan is Darkest Laserman. Now, most people would probably just ignore this guy, but let me reassure you, Darkest Laserman was an actual menace. What made him and Hydronoid so dangerous is they could attack from any place on the field. For those of you who don't remember, the original Bakugan followed different rules than they did from New Vestroia and onwards. Instead of everyone fighting on one gate card, you had 3 sets of gate card each. In each turn you would take turns setting a gate card, then you would throw your Bakugan. So let's say you threw out a Bakugan that had 250. And Laserman was, let's say, 370. If Masquerade used an ability that could attack any Bakugan on the field, well, you lose, because you can't really defend yourself that way. It was very, very broken, and it wasn't just Laserman who had this ability, but also Hydronoid. It's not a surprise that Masquerade was able to power through and get to rank 1 at one point. Masquerade's voice actor is Leon Smith. He also plays Prince Hydron in New Vestroia, and the player character in the Bakugan Battle Brawlers video game. Or, you know, Leonidas' partner, since that's what everyone calls him. When Masquerade had defeated Dan and sent Drago to the Doom Dimension, the rest of the Battle Brawlers formed a plan to rescue him, where they had also challenged Masquerade and were also sent to the Doom Dimension afterwards. The only way they could have escaped is that the Ancient Warriors all put them through a test so they could evolve their Bakugan, and then they would send them home. During this time, Masquerade had challenged Webmaster Joe so he could acquire Wyvern and the Infinity Core for Naga. However, Masquerade suffered his first major loss at the hands of Joe and Wyvern. Realizing that his Hydronoid needed more power, he decided to go to the Doom Dimension, challenge one of the Ancient Warriors, and evolve his Hydronoid for a second time. The Ancient Warrior Exedra accepts Masquerade's challenge and gives him a test of his own. Each one of these tests that the Masquerade and the Brawlers had to go through was reflective of what each of them had to go through mentally so they could accept a part of themselves, and their Bakugan would then evolve as a result. However, Masquerade's test is pretty interesting. He has to battle Alice while she uses Exedra. However, we didn't know Masquerade was Alice at the time, or at least it wasn't revealed to us, and Exedra then explains that this isn't the real Alice. This is a physical manifestation on how he views Alice. He then later defeats her and Hydronoid evolves, but it just asks the question, what in the world was the point of this test? So even though we were not supposed to know that Alice was Masquerade at this point in the story, Masquerade already knows that he is Alice. And fake Alice even asks him the question, "Are you afraid of me?" And he then responds, "Why would I be afraid of you? I know everything about you." And despite all the insults, because he thinks it's laughable that she of all people is his opponent, remember, this isn't the real Alice, it's a physical manifestation of how he sees her. And this version of Alice is the most confident version of Alice we've seen in the entire show. And while he doesn't seem too interested at first, once this version of Alice starts putting up more of a fight than he expected, he clearly starts being upset. And Alice starts asking the same question over and over, what is he fighting for? What does he gain through all this? And he basically tells her that he has to be the strongest because it's the will of Naga. And if you remember, with the exception of Dan and Drago, every other test has them evolve, but the test is still ongoing. They still have to defeat the Ancient Warrior. And I think even though Masquerade evolved Hydronoid, his test wasn't actually done yet. I believe that his test was two things. One, he has to find a reason to battle besides just because Naga told him to. And through his final battle with Dan, he realized that it's completely fine to just battle to have fun. The second part of this test is to accept Alice. Based off of how this version of her was so confident in her abilities, Masquerade knows that if she truly tries, she'll be a real force to be reckoned with. And the reason why he rejects Dan's offer to join the Battle Brawlers is because that's not his place, that's Alice's spot. And now that he's accepted Alice, he believes that she has what it takes to save the world alongside her friends. Alice just has to do the same thing and believe in herself. And with that, we are officially done with Masquerade. It goes without saying, I loved this character growing up, and I still do. He had such a huge impact on the franchise, and if he wasn't here, a lot of other things just wouldn't happen. For example, we wouldn't have Spectra if Masquerade wasn't here. And it's just a shame that Alice left the show after New Vestroia, because if Alice left, then Masquerade would also leave. And it's a weird scenario. I actually loved where Masquerade ended off. I think his final battle ever being with Dan as a team up was a phenomenal idea, but I can think of a couple scenarios where they could have technically squeezed Masquerade and if they wanted to bring him back properly for an extra fight. If that's something you guys want to see, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Later.